welcome everybody. I'm sorry we're having technical difficulties with this thing. We've what? Speak louder. Okay, I can do that. I can make it go up to that level. I'll do that. I've had 50 years of experience teaching, and I know how to do that. I'm a retired professor from UCSD, and I live here in Solana Beach, and I'm involved with Solana Beach Community Connections. And we're very happy to be co-sponsoring a series with Friends of the Libraries. This is actually the third in our series. Some of you may have been to the other one. The first one was by the war in Ukraine. It was done by Bronislav Slanchev, who is also a professor at UCSD and who lives here in Solana Beach. And that was in September. And then we had a second in the series, which was done by Jonathan Schwartz, who's founder of Partners in Aging, and it was called Aging Well in the 21st Century. So you may see a theme here. These are two very different subjects, and it was part of our plan as we try to learn what the community would like to hear, that we had two ideas. One was a series on public policy, and Bronislav was on the first set of themes, and the other was a series on aging. And so we thought we would try to do both and see how you all, the community, responded to that. So this is the second in our series on policy, and we're having the second in our series on aging in next month. And I'm just looking at the right date for it, which I have it here somewhere. It's February 21st, and it's on Hospice Isn't So Scary with Jin and Sharon Lau. So you will get information. Be happy to send you information on that. The first two programs that we've done, each of the programs that we're doing, we're taping them, and we're trying to tape them at any rate, and we have posted them. Both organizations have websites, and we posted them on the website. So if you missed the first two, they're available on the website, and you can see it there. If you don't know how to get to the website, ask me or any of the other staff people and any other members of the board of Solana Beach Community Connections, and we can tell you afterward how to find it. Actually, that's how you find it. You go to Solana Beach Community Connections, and that is our website, and it's open on there, and Friends of the Library has it on their website as well. So, as I say, this is our second in the policy series, and tonight's speaker is Professor of Economics at UCSD, and he has a chair at our School on Global Policy and Strategy. He also lives here in Solana Beach. When we started to do this, I suggested to people, I said, you know, we have an extraordinary number of people who just even live here in Solana Beach. And if you add Del Mar and Encinitas and other places around here, there's a tremendous amount of talent that are just living here, and we're not using it adequately. And we think that there might be community interest in hearing some of them talk about the things that they work on. So Josh has a chair at our School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's the director of the Peter Cowrie Center on Global Transformation, co-director of UCSD's Global Health Institute, and a research associate of the NBER, which is the National Bureau of Economic Research. I know I shouldn't be staring at this and addressing you, but I have to memorize that. His interests in research include the environment, health, innovation, and development. He works on the connection among environment, health, and human capital, the economics of innovation and productivity, and the design of health interventions and their health impacts. For a little factoids about John, he has he has a PhD from UC Berkeley. He taught 11 years at Columbia. He spent a year as a senior economist at Health and the Environment at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. That's a very impressive record, and I remember when we recruited him, we considered ourselves very fortunate in getting him to come here. And one of the reasons he came here is his wife, who's in the crowd, got an interesting job offer, but that always makes life very complicated. And so we were able to use that to our benefit and to hopefully your benefit, which you will find out right now, because I'm very pleased to introduce Josh. Amongst you can see from his record, there are a lot of topics he could talk about, but we knew there was a lot of interest in having him talk about today's topic, which is inflation and the U.S. economy. So Josh is going to talk. Unfortunately, he will have to talk without slides. And after his talk, we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions. And Josh is a great teacher, and we'll have a lot of fun doing all this together. But Josh, thank you very much for doing this. It's my pleasure.
Can you guys, am I mic'd? Is that working? Great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see familiar faces and some new faces. Apologies about the slides. I will send them to the library folks and they can post them. I spent time mostly just pulling pictures off the internet. Some of them are pretty great pictures, so they're worth checking out. I might even describe them, even though I don't have them behind me. But before I do any of that, I want to set the record straight about two things. I am an economist by training. For many people, that usually involves almost immediately asking me how they can make money, what they should do about the stock market. I just want to get that out of the way. If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be phoning this in from my yacht. I don't know how to make money on the stock market. Most economists do not. Let me also say, Peter was a former colleague and is a dear friend. And as only dear friends can do, he convinced me to sign up for a talk. It's true, I do many things in economics. Macroeconomics, the subject of our talk today, is one of the few things I do not work on. So I do a lot of work on labor markets. They're clearly related, but not on macro per se. So bear with me. I am going to try my best to keep this as non-technical and as relevant as possible. And you guys will jump in and tell me if I'm doing a bad job. So I came into tonight not really knowing sort of who the audience would be and how conversant they would be with any of these things. So I want to start with the simplest observation that almost certainly is permeating your ears, even if you're not paying attention to it from the news, and that is inflation, inflation talk. Oh my God, inflation. We have inflation. What are we going to do about inflation? I want to start by saying, first, what is inflation? Inflation is really just a description of or a characterization of an economy in which prices are with regularity increasing. That is to say, all of us remember older relatives who used to say a loaf of bread used to cost a nickel, or a gallon of gasoline used to cost a dime, and now it costs this. That's the result of inflation. And economies go through periods of modest inflation and more significant inflation. And depending on where you live in the world, some of those significant episodes of inflation are quite dramatic. And I had some really amazing slides, which I'm going to tell you about in a second. The key way, the most important way to think about this is take a bundle of goods, the same exact goods, look at what they cost today, look at what they cost tomorrow, look what they cost a month from now. It's the exact same bundle of goods. So in principle, it should be the same cost. If those costs are going up, then we describe the period as inflationary. We always, almost always, Japan is the exception, have some modest level of inflation. That's fine, even healthy for an economy. But we worry when inflation gets high. And in particular, we worry that as inflation gets high, there are some feedback loops that can make inflation kind of spiral out of control. And that's really bad for the economy. And I'm going to try to explain why that's bad for the economy, what we do about it, and why what we do about it is also in the news and whispering in your ear and a little complicated. So first, some terminology. You may hear the word CPI or consumer price index thrown around, or you might hear PCE is the preferred measure, personal consumption, personal consumer expenditure. Those are just measures of this. They're not important. Just throwing out some terminology so next time you're racing through the dial and you hear NPR talk about the PCI, you know what they're referring to. The main distinction that is important to keep in mind is there is a measure of this. They won't even tell you sometimes what the measure is, but there's inflation, there's core inflation. Inflation is the price, the average price of everything and how that price is changing, usually reported on an annual basis. So I'm going to give you in a second the number from this December, which reports how much prices changed this December relative to last December. And the core inflation measures are those exact same measures, but throw out energy and food, because energy and food prices are very volatile. And so if you throw them in a volatile period, they're going to make inflation look much larger than they are. At the moment, and again, this is a moving target, but at the moment, we'll get another number in a couple of days. December to December, current rate of inflation is 6.5%. That means whatever you bought for $100 last December is now $106.50. And the current core rate is 5.7%. So some of that is reflecting the volatile energy prices, which you've all experienced if you put gas in your car over the past year. The key thing to keep in mind is that the Federal Reserve and macroeconomists generally are happy. They're not a happy bunch in general, but at least in this context, they are generally happy when we're hovering around 2 or 3%. So all this talk you hear about high inflation, high inflation, high inflation is a concern that we're considerably above 2 or 3%. I want you to keep in mind that if I were giving this talk 3 months ago, I would have given you the number for October to October inflation. That number would have been 9.5%. So the number's bumping around a little bit, and we're worried that it might bump up instead of down, right? Again, we're not in a crazy environment at the moment. The concern about inflation is that it is easy in this, once you start feeding into higher levels of inflation, that those things can escalate. For those of you in the room who remember the 1960s and 1970s in this country, we lived through many, many episodes, including the early 80s, of double-digit inflation rates, right? That means that whatever you bought at the beginning of the year was 10 to 15% higher the end of the year. You can imagine what that might imply for a variety of behaviors that matter. Before I talk about sort of what's driving the current situation, I want to at least, since I spent so much time reading blogs and wasting my afternoon finding cool pictures, I want to tell you what's on my slides that that was designed to say, well, you know, we might be worried about 6%, but let's put this in perspective. So picture number one, this is not going to be hard to picture. Picture number one is a picture of a receipt from a gentleman who posted, all of these are tweets, a gentleman who tweeted his receipt from a cafe in Lebanon. Lebanon is experiencing incredibly high rates of hyperinflation at the moment. And if I look at this receipt, what I can see is in the period, he ordered his first cafe latte at 10 a.m. I think my reading glasses are not even good enough to read that. I think it's 10 a.m. And what I do remember quite distinctly is he ordered a second cafe latte 2.5 hours later, and the price had gone up 10%. Right? So on this receipt, 2 exact items, 2 different prices. The guy sat in a cafe for 3 hours. That's inflation you should worry about. Right? That's Lebanon. I also have a very evocative picture. Again, I'm going to post these of a bunch of household items that people buy everywhere, but in particular, this is a picture from Venezuela, also experiencing hyperinflation. Bunch of household items, so a chicken that you might roast for dinner, a roll of toilet paper, a bundle of tomatoes, and some laundry detergent, and the stacks of notes, of banknotes you need to buy those things, and the stacks are this high, right? Because the currency inflation is so rampant that now to buy those goods, you need to bring stacks and stacks and stacks, envelopes, briefcases of bills just to make those simple purchases. And then lastly, I have, because I'm partial to Argentina for reasons that some of you know, I have this great picture in front of a bakery that says, well, I won't read it in Spanish because I can't read the little sign, but what it says in Spanish on a little chalkboard in front of this cafe is, buy today, it's cheaper than tomorrow, right? And Argentina is also experiencing hyperinflation. Those hyperinflationary moments, which are ongoing at this very moment in those places, are things that make central bankers break out into a cold sweat. And those are the very same things that make financial hawks and monetary policy makers worried as rates go from 2% to 5% to 6%, worried we're going to get to 10% or 15% and so forth and so on. So that's what inflation is. That's why we're worried about it. There are historically a couple of important reasons why we have inflation, why inflation arises. And I'm not going to spend time talking about sort of the litany of reasons that might occur or that have occurred in the past. I want to focus my attention on the 4 causes that are driving inflation at this particular moment in this particular country, and in other countries as well, but each country has a sort of own unique flavor or mix of these things. And I want to say, first and foremost, they take away my license if I don't say the word supply and demand at least once in this talk. So let me say, first and foremost, the reason why prices go up, always, everywhere, in every case, is because for some reason or another, demand is greater than supply, right? For some reason or another, more people want this stuff than can be produced, and so prices get bid up, right? So the question we want to ask ourselves at this particular moment is, what is driving that gap between supply and demand in this particular moment? The first, which is waning but still relevant to the conversation today, is supply chain disruptions from COVID, right? You haven't lived, unless you've been living, in isolation, you haven't not heard about supply chain disruptions over the past 3 years. Most significantly in all of those is the utter and complete lockdown of human activity in China. And this is, in a way, a brave new world for the economy in the US and the economy writ large, because each and every year, supply chains get thicker and more complicated and more interconnected. So when things shut down in a place that's very far away and that 35 years ago we might not have even known about, those things have tremendous ripple effects on all the products you purchase here, right? There's a reason why you couldn't get cars, and the reason you couldn't get cars is because there was a chip shortage. One particular, not even a particularly complicated chip that you couldn't get because Chinese factories are shut down, because everyone in Shanghai and Beijing and the relevant provinces that make those chips were locked in their apartments to combat COVID, right? So the good news, the bad news is that we've done a lot in the last 2.5 years to address those supply chain issues. If you run a company, you probably have done some things yourselves. Some of that is to source materials from new places, to build in redundancy so we're not beholden to one particular supplier and one particular thing. And some of that's still ongoing. To be perfectly honest, the biggest difference of all is that China decided to no longer lock down, which has had tremendous human cost in China over the past 3 months. Latest statistics, over 1 million people have died since they stopped sheltering in place. But the factories are running again and things are being produced again, and that is at least relieving some of that supply chain bottleneck. So that's the good news. That's a problem that was massive initially, is abating at the moment. It's also the main reason why, if you pay attention to these things, the Federal Reserve was saying all along as prices were going up, don't worry, it's transitory, don't worry, it's transitory, don't worry, it's transitory. Maybe it's not transitory. So that part, I think, has been transitory. It's not totally fixed, and there's some more nuance that we can talk about in the Q&A. But that's been a real negative shock to supply. Number 2, related to COVID again, binge buying like a drunken sailor when COVID was over, right? So what happened? Everybody was locked down. All they could do was watch Netflix. They couldn't really spend money. They didn't go on vacation. People accumulated savings. There were lots of stimulus programs that actually put money in people's pockets, particularly lower income people. And then we kind of did our slow release from isolation. And collectively, I'm not saying anyone in this room, but collectively we have gone on a serious bender of a shopping spree, particularly for capital goods, cars, washing machines, all those things. So as you might imagine, it takes a little bit of time to cook up a new washing machine and a new car, especially if your supply chain is disrupted. And then when all of a sudden you see a 20, 30, 40% surge in demand for those things, you're going to see price increases. So binge buying is a problem. Again, that one's a little transitory, but that's a problem on the demand side. We've got 2 other problems at play that are maybe not so transitory, and the forecast for where they're going to go is a little tricky, and I'm going to mention a 4th one at the very end here. The third major factor at the moment is the Ukraine-Russia war. So as you've probably heard, Ukraine is a major exporter of agricultural products. Russia is a major exporter of petrochemical products. We are doing our best to try not to buy those Russian products, and so is Europe and so are others. That's leading to price increases and price volatility in fossil fuels in particular. That's important not just to think about, not just when you go to fill up your gas tank or turn on your heater. Remember, those fossil fuels are also what powers every factory that's making every other thing that you might buy. So energy is an input to everything in the economy. As energy prices go up, all the other prices go up. The food prices are yet another, and we've seen lots of volatility there and some moments in which stuff can get out, but that's a particular problem and leading to real concerns about famine in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, that's a supply shock to both energy and food that's leading to increase in prices. And then the last thing, which is a funny thing to talk about, but it really, really matters, is psychology and the psychology of inflation. And the folks who've lived through hyperinflation, either in this country or in other countries, can tell you that this psychology is very real. When you sit and you look out in the world and you think the prices of everything are going up, it makes you want to buy things now. Buying things now means you're increasing, putting more pressure on demand, which then leads to this vicious cycle of driving prices higher and higher, right? So the fact that we were saying, oh my goodness, I better buy this washing machine now, it's going to be 10% higher next year, means more people rush out to buy washing machines, which means it's not going to be 10% next year, it's going to be 20% higher next year, or maybe even 10% higher in 3 months. That psychology really, really matters. And for a bunch of buttoned up bankers who, go to Jackson Hole and try to decide how to set the federal funds rate, which we're going to talk about, they spend an awful lot of time talking about human psychology and what the consumer believes. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So, rising prices are bad, or I've alleged they're bad. Why are they bad? Why do we care about these rising prices? Well, in some sense, we don't have to care about these prices if all of our collective wages are moving as fast or faster than those prices. In that case, we'd say our real income was going up. In practice, wages don't and aren't keeping up with these price increases. They're keeping up a little bit better at the moment in the US than they are in Europe, partly because of the nature of the different labor markets. Europe is more unionized. That means wages move in lockstep at much longer intervals, but then they tend to move in larger steps. But in any case, these higher prices essentially mean that paycheck you got last month is gonna buy you less stuff next month than it is this month, right? And that's bad for consumers. Eroding purchasing power is ultimately bad for consumers. Consumers in part drive part of the economy, so as consumers feel that they are able to purchase less, they're going to make some cutbacks, and that's going to be a drag on the economy. This is a huge problem for particular subsets of the population, right? So I had, just again, let me tell you about my slides. I had these great slides, one from the New Yorker that says, I can't believe the price of my chicken marsala at a very fancy restaurant. It was this last month and it was that last month. So that's sort of tongue-in-cheek. If you're living pretty well, then this inflation is a bummer, but it's not life-altering. If you are, and then I have another slide that basically is a family sitting around the table saying, which one of we going to get rid of because we can't afford to have all these kids anymore. And that's a very real reality for people living in lower income strata. It's a particular problem for people who are on fixed income. So for retirees, this is an issue. If you're getting a fixed amount of money out of a pension, out of Social Security thankfully is indexed to inflation, so that's a little bit less of a problem. If you're getting a fixed income, that income buys less and less, and you're retired, you don't have the opportunity to replace that income in other ways. It causes a lot of headache and grief. And then lastly, and importantly, from the economy's perspective, inflationary pressures put a tremendous amount of uncertainty on businesses and business decision makers. So if you're a firm and you're trying to decide, Do I expand to a new outlet? Do I expand my workforce? Do I buy that new piece of equipment? I have to forecast what all of that's going to cost me now, what it's going to cost me in the future, what demand for my product is going to be in the future, given fairly erratic and unpredictable price profiles going forward, particularly for firms that are buying long-lasting pieces of equipment. You're going to buy something now and it's going to work for you for the next 20 years. You want to know what kind of revenue that's going to generate for you for the next 20 years. That's harder to forecast. It's always hard to forecast. It's harder to forecast in an inflationary environment. So those are the reasons why for consumers, particularly fixed income and low income folks, it's bad for consumers, it's bad for firms. So we don't like it. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I told you it's all about supply and demand. We kind of have two potential tools here, and I'm here to tell you we kind of really only have one tool. We could do something about supply, and to the extent that we can, we have sort of started to try to address supply chain issues, right? So if you're Europe, you're trying as fast as you can to complete LNG terminals so you don't have to get your gas through pipelines and you can get it out of boats. But that happens on a very slow time scale. And frankly, so much of what happens in supply chain isn't at the discretion of governments. It's individual firms deciding how to adjust on those margins. And that happens on a slow and idiosyncratic basis. So if we're asking or we're imagining the government is going to do something to respond to inflation, the main tool they have is to kill off demand, to get you all collectively to buy less stuff, right? And not just you as a consumer, but you as a firm. And the way they do that, and again, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know on some level, is that they tinker with the Federal Reserve's interest rate, of which all other interest rates are tied either implicitly or explicitly. So what are we going to do to address inflationary pressure? We're going to increase the cost of borrowing. And since borrowing's more expensive, we're going to be less likely to buy a car, we're going to be less likely to buy a new house, we're going to be less likely to refinance our house. If we're a business, we're going to be less likely to invest in that business. And all of those things are going to slow down or diminish the demand pressures that are placed on an economy that are driving prices higher, right? But that probably sounds bad to you on many levels. You don't want to have to spend more money to borrow money. You probably don't want firms to fire workers and invest less in equipment that might help that firm grow. And you'd be right in not wanting those things. And that's why the job of the Federal Reserve is a particularly difficult one. Because the Fed really has to walk this tightrope between, at the moment, we've had a great run, I should say, for the last 25 years in which inflation was really low. And so we didn't have to worry about this. In fact, there were some macroeconomists that thought we'd never have to worry about this again. We have to worry about it again. The question is, how do we calibrate our response to kill off demand without killing off the economy, right? And what you may know, if you're watching the news, you're seeing like, oh my God, Amazon fired 20,000 employees and Google fired 10,000 employees. And here in San Diego, the biotech community is particularly impacted. The reason why the tech sector and the biotech sector are particularly impacted is they're very leveraged industries. They borrow a lot of money, they make big investments, which eventually bear fruit, but when the cost of that borrowing goes up, those industries struggle to find financing or find financing at reasonable costs. The same is true for the housing market, and you've probably heard some about some dampening on the housing market. So the Fed really is trying to walk a tightrope here in terms of contracting that inflationary pressure without completely killing the economy. So how are they going to do? How are they doing? Right? So the timing of this is auspicious. So not only did Peter put me in the hot seat and ask me to talk about macro, of which I know very little about, but I'm going to have to given the way we've structured the talk, I have to leave you here with my forecast of what's going to happen. And tomorrow, the Fed is going to announce what they're doing with interest rates. So you will know if I'm right or wrong tomorrow. So what's the prognosis for 2023? And I'm going to tell you one thing. This is probably going to be the only thing you're going to remember. But you've heard lots of people, are we in a recession? Are we going to be in a recession? Were we already in a recession? What's going to happen? So one of my affiliations with the National Bureau of Economic Research, they are the official umpire of recessions. They get to call, are we in a recession or not? And there are some rules, there's some squishiness to the rules, but the rules are essentially several consecutive, at least the interpretation of them is several consecutive quarters of negative growth. That is decreased GDP or proxy measures for GDP. So what it means to be in a recession, what it means to call a recession, remember, is several quarters. So say 6 months of contraction before we call a recession. Whether we call it a recession or not is irrelevant. It's like telling the mother of a 3-month-old that she's pregnant. It's a little too late, right? So it doesn't matter whether we're in recession now or whether we're going to be in recession later, whether it's going to get called, it's not going to get called. What matters is the economic contraction. Is it ongoing? What are its causes? Are we addressing the problem? Are they going to be persistent? Are they going to be steep? All of those questions are the relevant questions you want to be asking yourself. And I'm here to tell you, nobody knows the answer to those things. So what do folks do? They look at tons and tons and tons of indicators that are kind of barometers for how the economy is doing, right? And those include consumer sentiment, yield curves, manufacturing indexes, sentiment indexes of employers, unemployment figures, GDP figures. There's some bespoke models that come out of Washington, D.C. that, despite being bespoke, aren't any better than anything else. And they use all of those things and they kind of say, are they all pointing in the same direction? Are there mixed reviews? Would people have preferences for which ones they kind of really buy into? I'm going to tell you, so this is the big lead up to my big reveal here, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to tell you what I'm seeing in the tea leaves. First, on the good side, GDP growth for quarter 4, those numbers are just released. So for the last quarter of 2012 was a positive 2.9%. That's good, right? That's not recession talk, as recession talk would have a negative number in front of that. But again, that's the quarter that includes Christmas, which tends to be better. And in any case, it's backward looking. But at least backward looking doesn't look so bad. The labor market is still amazing. I mean, it really is amazing. Despite all the firing at Amazon and whatever, and the trends are certainly moving to some deceleration here, we still have incredibly low unemployment rates. That's one measure. If you look at new jobless claims, that's people claiming unemployment insurance for the first time, those numbers are incredibly low. And if you look at now, we have data on job openings and job turnover, the data on job openings is not too bad. So the labor market looks good. That's sort of good news and bad news, because we need that labor market to not look really good, or else we're back in inflationary pressure world, right? Because if the labor market's really tight, we got to pay more wages to get people, and that's going to raise the cost of stuff. On the other hand, we're not looking at massive layoffs that typically get associated with at least major recessions. And then the last thing, which I didn't even know, but in preparation for this, I went and looked at the latest figures. Interestingly enough, consumer confidence, I mean, given all the bad news you've heard about everything that's going on, consumer confidence is up almost 10% in the past month. So I guess we took our medicine and now we're feeling better about it, but consumer confidence is up. So that's good news, because confident consumers means that they're going to be out there engaged in the economy in a variety of ways. There's also some bad news. There's some neutral news. I'll spare you all that. There's some bad news. Retail sales are down in the latest figures about 1%. Again, not massive, but down. Small business sentiment, that's the opposite. So consumer sentiment, how are you feeling as a consumer? University of Michigan runs that survey every year. They've been running for 60 years. It's actually a good indicator of where the consumer psyche is. There's a newer variant of this that asks small businesses, how are you feeling about your prospects as a small business? That's looking pretty bad. And it's looking, and that decline has been big. And so you could imagine small businesses in particular don't have the cushion, they don't have the war chest of cash on hand to survive these shocks, and costs of borrowing are going up. It's a particularly difficult time for small businesses. And then the last, which I'm going to mention, and it's the only technical thing I'm going to say here, but you hear it on NPR, and it's useful to know what it means. We are in a world of inverted yield curves. So yield curve says basically, yield curves essentially say how much is the federal government paying on treasuries that come due in a month, that come due in 6 months, that come due in 2 years, and 5 years, and 10 years, and 15 years, and 20 years. And in normal times, the interest rate on the 30-year treasury is higher than on the 1-month treasury because you're going to have all this time to accumulate prosperity, et cetera. An inverted yield curve says the long-term rate is actually lower than the short-term rate. That's the inverted part. And that's bad because it says people are feeling, and I don't mean just people like, how do you feel about this? Like investors who have real skin in the game are feeling sufficiently sanguine about our future prospects that they're betting that we're going to earn more money in the near term than we are in the medium term, right? That number I was quoting is the 1 year versus 10 year. But you're in here, inverted yield curves. If you happen to walk past CNBC at the gym, you're going to see some guy in a red or blue tie who's all worked up about inverted yield curves. They have pretty good predictive power, but all of this is really a dark art and not a science. So I'm almost at my forecast. Let me just say, as of this week, the IMF has upgraded its global forecast to avoiding a recession. So who needs me? You've got the IMF. As of 3 weeks ago, the World Bank said, no, we're definitely going to have a global recession. So we need somebody to arbitrate, right? Here's my forecast, and then I'm going to offer you some caveats. My forecast is mild recession. We're not going to learn this tomorrow. We'll only learn one piece of this tomorrow. Mild recession, pretty short-lived. Maybe so short-lived that by the time they call the recession, it'll be over. So I'm thinking 6 months to a year, not a deep recession, but certainly one that will recalibrate things. It will be, so second, interest rates are going to remain high for a while. The markets have priced, so we're going to learn at 2 p.m. Eastern or 2:30 Eastern when they all finish their Jackson Hole powwow, what the new rate increase is going to be. The market is priced 25 basis points or 0.25%. My prediction is 0.5 or 50 basis points. So you can all say, haha, you were wrong if you see me tomorrow. Those interest rates, either way, up 0.25 or up 0.5, they're still going to be hovering at a much higher level. That's going to make things hard for the tech sector and the housing sector, right? Because borrowing costs are going to be high, and they're going to be high for at least a couple more years. I can't forecast much more out beyond that. The important caveats I want to make to all of those forecasts, not just mine, but everyone's, and I suppose everyone at this point makes these caveats, but there are two are obvious, the third maybe a little less so. The first is, we don't know what's going to happen in the Ukraine war. If that thing escalates, if it spills over borders, if it continues, that's going to lead to more inflationary pressure and make this more difficult, above and beyond the humanitarian costs, of course. Second, another big COVID surge, either because we have a dramatic response, like we shut things down again, or because we have a big COVID surge and lots of people are staying home or are sick and can't go to work, so therefore we're going to have some productivity shocks. That's going to be a problem. Hopefully the worst of that is behind us. The last one I want to flag for you, which I hope is just, nothing but cheap talk, is, we are engaged in an increasingly muscular posture vis-a-vis trade policy with China about a whole bunch of things, including now like selling inputs to Huawei to make their phones, which they're not even allowed to sell here anyway. Insofar as those trade wars escalate, as much as we've talked about deepening our global supply chains and redundancies and the rest, much of what we consume in this country has at least part of its components made in China. And if we end up in anything resembling even a moderate scale trade war with China, not even talking about problems with in the Strait of Taiwan and all the rest of the global potential flare-ups, that will be a real buzzkill for inflation and a real problem we'll tip this, what I'm forecasting is a mild recession, into something much more significant. In any case, I have gone too long. I've spent too much time talking about slides you can't see. So let me stop there and take some questions from everybody.
So let's go to China. So we talked about all the things they supply us. What is your food and water supply? And how are they solving their grain issues and their protein issues and their carbohydrates?
You know, I have to say, I would say, let me validate the challenge you've raised. China has a problem, as does India, frankly, in feeding its enormous populations. Despite what you might, well, I don't know what folks imagine from China, but China is still very much a middle income country with 1 billion people. India is an even poorer country with 1 billion people. So the challenges to that scale of operation for everything remain. I don't know, I can't speak to ongoing internal policies in China. I mean, frankly, I'm not sure who can, given that she has sort of seemed to have torn up the old playbook and gone to a new one. What I can say is China, like the US and many other places, has tremendous inequality. And so the brunt of those shortages are felt in rural communities that are, from the narrow, selfish perspective of the US, reasonably disconnected from the global supply chains from which we've been talking about today. I don't say that to diminish the crisis or the humanitarian issues that are ongoing there, but from a global supply chain issue perspective, I don't see those as a threat, at least in its current form, to the world, the globalized world order in terms of trade.
Yes, I read where the Federal Reserve manipulates interest rates by buying and selling bonds, and they were like 13-week bonds or something. Is there always a buyer for those, or what happens if nobody wants to buy those bonds?
Well, if we default on our debt in a couple of weeks, months, it's soon, not everyone will buy those bonds. But so far, we've never had a problem selling those bonds, in part because the US has this incredible reputation of being, historically, the most reliable lender in the world. That is reputational, right? It's earned, but it can be unearned. So it is true, I didn't want to talk about, there's quantitative easing, there's bond buying, there's printing money, there's all kinds of things the Fed can and historically has done, and the bond buying actually has been retreated. We did a ton of bond buying starting in 2008 during the financial crisis, and then we had a lot of trouble weaning ourselves off that. We've been slowly weaning ourselves off that. That's all part of the armamentarium here. We never seem to have a problem selling them, but you know, past is not necessarily prelude. You still have to earn that reputation. And there are certainly folks, including the Chinese government and the folks who are launching cryptocurrencies, who want to be the reliable lender on record and displace the U.S. as that nation or currency.
You commented that people's psychology affects what happens in the marketplaces. What happens when the government says we're in a recession? How does that affect people, and what happens with it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So fortunately or unfortunately, the government doesn't get to say. So the NBR is a non-part. I am an affiliate. I'll give you the full disclosure. We're a non-partisan, independent, blah, 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 blah. So we get to call it. Does it give people grief in Washington, D.C. when we do? Yes. Yes, it does. I think that the answer is, if what you want, so again, what the Fed wants, and even if they could do this without raising interest rates credibly, they would be happy if they could just convince everyone, hey, you should stop spending stuff because things are not great, whether it's because of a recession or because of raising interest rates or because like Jay Powell puts on a scary ghost mask, whatever it would take would be fine. Because we just, like I said, the inflationary problem is we just need to diminish demand. Not too much, but some. The challenge we're going to face is twofold. I haven't really talked much about this, but those interest rate hikes that we've been experiencing, we know they have a decent latency period. So the risk is that we overshoot, right? And you'll hear that from lots of folks, particularly on Wall Street. Oh, we're going to overshoot, we're overshooting. It's hard to know whether we're going to overshoot, but we do know that the effects of those things take a little bit of time to materialize in the market. And so the concern is if those interest rate hikes are already putting significant brakes, then we announce a recession. Everybody says, oh my God, I need to tighten my belt and spend even less. Then yeah, that can hasten the recession and make it a bit worse still. The one thing I will say is, at least in contemporary times, COVID aside, we're not exactly a nation of savers. So when we hear recession, the question is, are we borrowing less? Not are we saving more? And that has slightly different, that leads to slightly different manifestations in terms of economic growth in the long.
How concerned should we be about the amount of U.S. debt held by China?
Well, I didn't even tell you the really good news. The really good news is that inflation is amazing for U.S. debt. It means that we're paying them back in dollars that are worth less than when we lent it to them, right? And in fact, for a long time, several countries, which will go unnamed, had a at least implicit, if not explicit, policy to try to inflate their debt away. So, sorry, that's a sidebar to answer your question. I don't think we have anything to worry about in terms of. I think there are moments in which, and this is not one of those moments in my opinion, but reasonable people disagree. There are reasons to worry about the size of the debt. I don't think there are, at least at the scale we're talking about now, reasons to worry about who holds that debt. In part because there's no place else for anyone to go, right? And so for China to do anything, quote unquote, nefarious with the debt that they hold would have such enormous consequences that would largely fall upon them that it's just impossible to imagine.
Two parts, well, two questions. One is that at the time of shortages, when things were not available, all one heard was truck drivers aren't working and they've been given stimulus packages, doesn't pay them to work, and so all the ships and the cargo ships are sitting out in the bay and things aren't being loaded, blah, blah, blah. So was that really such a big cause of shortages? Was it one of the big causes? You mentioned four, but you didn't mention that. And my other question is, how would it affect our economy, and particularly in the US, if OPEC and oil is traded in other currencies and not in US dollars? And is that a big factor or a possibility or a scare? What is your opinion on that?
So let me take the second one first. I mean, the answer to that really depends on the currency it trades in particular, whether that currency is free floating or pegged to something, right? So, and that's, sorry if that sounds really esoteric or boring, but pegged currencies means that someone is choosing the rate or choosing the rate by connecting it to someone else's rate. And free floating currencies means that the value of that currency depends on how many people want to buy that debt and how many people want to get rid of that debt. And so, you know, that in free floating currencies, we believe the currency value is a better reflection of the inherent value of the things it's purchasing. In pegged economies and set pegged currencies and set currencies less so. So I think the answer is it depends in part on what currency we're talking about. And I think if I may be overreading your question, but I think the real concern is, particularly in the context of what's going on in Russia, that we end up creating two markets for oil that are essentially completely sealed from one another. And that is absolutely a bad outcome for a variety, for political reasons, but also for economic reasons. So markets work best when they're thick, when there are lots of agents trading, and when there are two markets that aren't allowed to communicate with one another for, say, political reasons. That would absolutely be a bad outcome. On your first question, it's hard to answer that question precisely because it involves lots of micro nuance. But at least in the context of ports, the huge problem with ports is that we really need some balance. So it is incredibly costly for ships to cross the Pacific, or the Atlantic for that matter, but most of it's crossing the Pacific empty. So we need stuff going back to China and coming out of China. And that really, that balance of trade really got shaken badly in the context of COVID and COVID lockdowns. Initially, frankly, it got shaken badly by us. China was saying, oh my God, these idiots are all locked up at home. We're just here living our best life. There's no problem here. And then more recently, the opposite problem, in which they really were in lockdown mode because they started to have outbreaks, and we were sort of in COVID 2.0. Either one of those is really a huge problem. You cannot imagine. There are these wonderful, I wish I didn't bring, I don't have it on my slides, but it's worth Googling. There's these wonderful maps of that you can find online quite easily of goods flow across the Pacific, and they light up, and you can kind of animate them, and it is sort of awe-inspiring how much product is moving at any one time from one place to the other. And then when you think about the economic consequences of empty container ships, which are enormous, you realize it doesn't take much. It's sort of like one winter storm in the airports really throws off all the travel, not just at that airport, but everywhere else. We had that problem in spades with COVID, and that was a big driver of the sort of transportation and shortage of goods problem.
Josh, I have a question which is kind of connected to that, so I'll try to answer it now. To what extent, what do you think is a problem in too little competition in certain goods areas? I've heard comments on that in various sectors of the economy, there are very few producers, and they, in a crisis situation like this, they are able to make prices rise, so there's not enough structural competition in various areas of the American.
I mean, on some level, it's got to be true. I think so. So I think that's right. And so when you have few producers, you've got not just more opportunity for shortage, but more opportunity for price gouging because you've only got one producer. I think the big, so yeah, but if I were to pick on one thing here, I would say, you know what? Since the 1980s, at least, we have collectively, not just the US, the entire world has been laser focused on lean production models. That is just-in-time inventory. Nobody's sitting on a warehouse with lots of stuff. It's like, oh, I'm going to order something from Amazon, and then some turbine like spins a little bit faster in Shanghai, and that thing gets spit over, and then it lands at your doorstep. When you have really lean, and that's great for economic efficiency. It means it's why things are cheaper now than they were in the 1980s. So we have greatly benefited from that lean production model, from that just-in-time production model. But what we've learned in the last 5 years is that lean, just-in-time, globalized production model, not even globalized, even domestically, is not very resilient to shocks of major consequence. And, you know, we hope the worst of COVID is behind us, but it's not going to be the last shock we see. And my big fear in all of this, you didn't ask me my big fear, but my big fear in this is that no one has the will to say, we're going to deliberately build in redundancies, resiliencies, and know that it's going to lead to slightly higher costs of goods production because we think that's what we need to be resilient, to be ready for the next storm. And this is a problem. This is not just a government problem. People underinsure. People say, oh, they buy 100-year flood for 50 years. They say, I haven't had a flood, and they cancel their policy, right? I mean, it's very hard to make those costly investments in anticipation of something that hasn't happened. And my fear is the moment to do it is now, because the emotion is still raw from the shocks we just had. We don't do it in the next 2 years. 5 years from now, we're like, I remember that COVID thing was so cute and disruptive, and now we're just living back in lean production world again. So that worries me. And I, you know, stay tuned, but I don't think we're gonna fix that one. So yeah, so sure, let me say the question out loud on the microphone. So the question is kind of this engagement of economics with psychology a new phenomenon, and is it a new phenomenon, and is it just reading the tea leaves or something more systematic about it? And I think the answer is certainly macroeconomists have thought about that psychology for a long time. They modeled that psychology. They modeled it wrong, as it turns out, but at least they were modeling it, so they were trying to think about that psychology. And that's the macro world. In the economics world more broadly, so now thank you for the question, because now I get to talk about things I actually know something about. In the economics world more broadly, behavioral economics is like the fastest growing sub-discipline in economics, and it really is essentially taking the tools of microeconomics, which are largely predicated on Homo economicus, which is like this hyper-rational individual who's like maximizing everything and carefully titrating everything, and recognizing, you know, the frailty of human decision making and all the things that affect the way in which we decide things, and emotion and salience and our ability to sense time and to make trade-offs, and integrate those into models to be better at predicting the things that we really care about predicting, understanding the relationships and predicting those relationships. So behavioral economics is this sort of, there's this big, it sort of started in a small way in the 80s and now is just growing by leaps and bounds. And so, I think some of the more exciting things that are coming out of the academy in particular are in that space. I mean, there's still plenty of tea leaf reading, as there always is, because again, sometimes you're trying to forecast something where you don't have a rich enough model, you don't have enough data, and yet a decision has to be made. So somebody has to make a best guess. The thing I always say in that context, and I've said that in the context of government where I've worked, in the context of companies where I've advised, it's fine to make your best educated guess absent better data, but collect the data after you make the decision so you can make the next decision a little bit better than this one.
Great. We have time for one more question, sir.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring up the issue of housing. In the last 8 years, the cost of buying a house, and that's fine if no one is buying houses. But the fact that bringing in 1 million more people inflates it even more and leads to speculation. So those parts of the economy that seem to do well are the ones that are most speculative. Clearly, it's not working the way we have a huge gap. And the second thing I think is I understand the Russian government defaulted on $100 billion loan. The last time that happened, it almost broke down. New York City, they got together and the banks, private commercial banks, bailed it out. But because of the war, because of the large amounts of money that are flowing back and forth, so the cost of land, the fact that people are making so much money off of speculation rather than on production and workers. And
Sure. So let me just say a few things about land, and then make a shameless endorsement for, you know, to do a little Marxian reading. So first, you're absolutely right. Prices are going up. Prices are going up because we don't like to build. Like, once we're here, we don't like anyone to build near us, and we don't like to build in density. And this is not a unique problem to California. And by the way, it's not even a unique problem in the United States. Secularly, what we've seen is housing prices going up in major metro areas and lots of countries around the world. Australia has seen doubling. Prices in London have gone up tremendously. A lot of that has to do with the combination of, I'll call it NIMBYism. It's not exactly NIMBYism, but very constraints on building, coupled with demographics. Right? I mean, we're still digesting the baby boom, and the baby boom is, so the baby boom all has their houses. We're pulling through, and now we had a second baby boom that's struggling to buy houses, and we haven't built more houses, right? So the baby boom is still in all the houses they had. There's this second wave of baby boomers who are coming up who feel priced out of housing, and that's in part because we haven't built housing to accommodate that growth of population. But let me say, to the larger point, what I take as the larger point here, which is that people who are speculating are making more money than laborers. I said tongue in cheek, but I mean it. If you haven't read, you don't have to read the whole thing because it's a good doorstop, but it's huge. Thomas Piketty's Capital. You can probably get an excerpt just of chapter 1, and then it kind of repeats itself over and over and over again. But what Thomas Piketty says, which is actually quite strongly rooted in the economic thinking of Karl Marx, is that historically the returns to capital have been much larger than the returns to labor, and that leads to dynastic wealth, and he generates a bunch of conclusions related to that. People have argued a lot about that book, but there is some really, really interesting data that goes back hundreds of years using church records from Europe that supports your contention, not just about housing, but about the returns to capital in general. If you're interested in what we do about that, Thomas Piketty has some pretty controversial suggestions in that book.
Well, thanks very much, Josh. That was a great
You did amazing without your slides. I don't think we would have been able to pull through this without some of